One of my viewers asked me if I can watch this video. It's called UK versus Australian Architecture Homes Design Comparison. So I thought this would be interesting. Obviously, being from the UK, I have a general knowledge of British homes. Australian architecture is also interesting to me. I play a game called GeoGuessr where you get dropped in a random place around the world. You have to guess where you are based on the environment. I always do quite well with Australia because I seem to recognise Australian suburbs. They seem quite easy to identify. Like the homes always seem a bit lower, spacious. There's always big gardens. The colours obviously seem to be different around the houses, not very uniformed in that way. And yeah, I'm interested to know the differences between homes in these two countries. One thing I think is more common in Australia is like people seem to build their own houses more often. I've got extended family and friends in Australia. A lot of them seem to build their own houses. Tell me if that's common in Australia. I think it's very uncommon in the UK. I don't know anybody that's built their own house, but yeah, let's watch this so we can see the differences.
Hi, I'm Lisa from Australian travel and migration blog dreamingofdownunder.com. Today I'm going to run through some of the differences between houses in the UK and houses in Australia. I grew up in the UK, but I've also house sat in around 100 homes in Sydney over the last few years, and I've noticed quite a lot of differences between homes in each country. There will be variations across Australia because the climate varies so much, but these are the things I've noticed in Sydney homes. I've also written a blog post on this, which I'll link below. If you're interested in moving to Australia from the UK or vice versa, here's what to expect in your new home. So the first difference between houses in Australia and the UK is that in the UK you tend to have a whole row of houses along a road that have the same design repeated over and over, whereas in Australia you can have every house on a road being completely different. And I think this is due to people buying land in Australia and then having a home built on it, rather than people buying existing homes like they do in the UK.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. That's why if I seen this, I think that's Australia because, oh yeah, all the houses are different. In the UK, you see this, it's just like property developers just building identikit houses. The whole area is just exactly the same. I mean, it's more interesting than looking at the Australian ones. They look like more unique and have that more individual personality as opposed to this. But I guess it's just different.
Some of the older housing in Australia is repetitive, like the old terraces and federation homes that you have in Sydney, but generally you've got a really wide variation of housing styles along the same street. Another difference is that houses in Australia usually have a veranda across the front of the house, and this creates shade across the front window, and it's also quite a nice feature because people put chairs and benches on them that face out into the street. In the UK it's more common to have a front porch if you've got space, so this is just a small glass room on the front of your front door, basically where you store shoes and umbrellas and things, but they do get quite hot if they're in the sun, so it wouldn't really work in Australia. If you look up at the roofs on Australian houses, you'll see that the eaves overhang the house much more than in the UK, and this creates shade against the windows. In the UK the eaves are really small and you get as much light as possible against the windows and as much warmth from the sun. The windows themselves are different between Australian and British homes. So in Australia, in the older homes you'll often have wooden framed sash windows, and in the newer homes you'll have big metal frames around your windows and they'll slide open sideways rather than opening outwards. In the UK you have nearly always double glazing, which you don't seem to have in Australia, and you normally have the thick plastic frames and windows that open outwards.
Yeah, that's definitely true as well. I think already the first couple for Australia definitely shows like that they're more suited to that hotter weather that we just don't really get as often in the UK. We have the double glazing here. I'm surprised that there's no double glazing in Australia, considering that places like Melbourne and things in the winter would still get relatively cold, I would imagine. Is that a problem? Do homes in Australia get quite cold at points during the year, especially during winter and that sort of thing?
You also have a layer of mesh, which is called a screen, over Australian windows, so that when you open them, flies and insects can't come in. In Australia, it's really common to have a screen door, which means that when you open your front or back door, you have a second door next to it, which is usually made of mesh, and that just means you can keep the door open, have the breeze coming through, but no insects can come in as long as you keep the screen door closed. In Australia, it's really common to have a separate laundry room or utility room for your washing machine. In the UK, unless you've got a large house, you normally have to have your washing machine in the kitchen. I don't think I've ever seen that in Australia. Sometimes in older flats they might have a communal laundry, but most of the apartments I've been in have had a separate laundry room inside the apartment.
Is that the case for everybody? Do you always have a separate room? I guess that would also show that Australian houses are just bigger in general than British houses. Again, in the UK, as you mentioned, I've only ever seen like washing machines and dryers like this under the sink or in the kitchen as part of the same room.
In Australia, it's really common to have open plan houses, so the living room, dining room and kitchen are all basically one open room, whereas in the UK, your kitchen is nearly always separate, and then your living room and dining room sometimes are knocked through, but it's normally separate rooms. In Australia, it's much more common to live in a bungalow or a one-storey house than two-storey houses, whereas in the UK, bungalows are quite scarce and usually something that older people go for because they don't have stairs. If you do have a two-storey house in Australia, it can get really, really hot up on the second floor if you don't have aircon. In the UK, you have a letterbox on your front door, so basically a little hole in your front door, whereas in Australia, you have a standalone letterbox that's out facing onto the street.
So do you not have letterboxes in your door as well? I would never have considered that. I think this seems like more American to my knowledge. I didn't know that was the same in Australia as well. It's interesting already that even though all the videos and things I've learned about Australia have such similar cultures, and Australia and UK very similar, that the homes are like almost completely different. But I guess it comes down to like things like climate and the weather's probably the main thing, yeah.
One of the biggest complaints that I hear from expats in Australia is how cold the houses get in Australia in the winter. So since Australian houses are built to stay cool, they're very often much colder inside than a British house would be in the same temperature. So generally in the daytime, it's colder inside the house in Australia than outside, whereas in the UK it's the opposite. It's nearly always warmer inside your house than outside.
Yeah, that's true.
One house I stayed in, it had a plug-in heater that had the temperature on, and when I woke up in the mornings it was usually about 9 degrees inside. So having central heating throughout your house is really rare in Australia, and if people do have it, it's usually through air vents rather than the radiators on the wall like we have in the UK. What some houses have in Australia is a standalone gas heater that's attached to a gas pipe either coming out of the floor or the wall. You can also buy small oil heaters in Australia that you plug in if you just want to heat at one room.
Yeah, tell me, does anybody in Australia have this type of radiator? I've actually not seen one of these for a few years now because I've not been back to the UK, but I kind of forget that's just in everybody's house. It's perfect during the winter where you can put your clothes on there before you wear them, get them heated up, and it just keeps the house nice and toasty. But here in Malaysia, definitely don't have anything like this. So yeah, have you ever seen one of these in Australia?
Having a fire on the wall in the living room isn't very common in Australia. I have seen it in a few houses, but very few compared to the UK. Some of the older houses in Australia quite often have chimney breasts and really nice original fireplaces, but they're not really used as much as they are in the UK. Obviously aircon is more common in Australia than in the UK, but not as many houses have it in Sydney as I expected actually. So looking at the back of the houses, in Australia it's also common to have a veranda on the back of the house as well as the front. Or if you don't have a veranda, there's usually some kind of solid covering that shades the patio, whereas in the UK you would rarely have a covering over your patio. You'd try and get as much light and heat as possible. Conservatories also don't seem to exist in Australia, so this is basically an extension on the back of your house that's usually made of glass. And these are really common in the UK, but I don't think that would be possible in Australia with the heat.
Yeah, that'd be like a sauna in Australia probably.
Having a swimming pool in your back garden is obviously much more common in Australia than it is in the UK. It's not as common as I thought it would be actually, although I would think going further north where it's hotter, it's probably more common to have a swimming pool.
This is definitely
the bathrooms in Australia are quite different to in the UK. So in the UK you can't have plug sockets in your bathroom normally, and in Australia you always have plug sockets. This is apparently due to some difference with the electrical systems in Australian houses. That means it's safe to have sockets in bathrooms where it can get wet. Also the light switches are different in Australia. So in the UK in your bathroom you always have a pull cord so that you don't have to touch a switch if you're wet, and in Australia it's just a normal light switch. And they also nearly always have fans in the bathroom, so you'll have a switch with a light on, the fan on, and occasionally also a heat switch where you have heated light bulbs.
Okay, man. Yeah, I never thought about that as well. Yeah, in the UK we don't have plug sockets in there. We do have this. This is usually what I thought that is just to turn on the heater in the shower. I never really considered that as well. Yeah, if you've got switches in the bathroom, yeah, I guess
this is a strange little
different
difference,
safety
but
requirements
in
now.
Australia the side of bathtubs are nearly always solid, so they're quite often tiled, whereas in the UK you tend to have a plastic panel. And I remember an Australian friend saying that she went to Wales and found this really strange because she'd never seen that before.
Is that
Also,
strange
sinks
to you
in
as well?
Australia, you nearly always have a cupboard underneath the sink in the bathroom, which we call a vanity. In the UK, it's more common just to have a sink on a stand. In Australia, they also have a few differences with household terminology. So what we'd call a sofa or a settee in the UK, Australians would call a lounge. And what we'd call a lounge or a living room in the UK, Australians would call the lounge room. Also, bedding and towels in Australia, they call this Manchester, which is meant to be from the olden days when cotton items had to be imported from Manchester in the UK.
Is that true? Do you call your bedding and towels Manchester? Is that common throughout Australia, or is that just Sydney? Yeah, we call these a living room. The duvet is called the doona. A flat's called a unit.
Also, a duvet is called a doona in Australia. They do use the word quilt as well though. A flat or apartment in Australia is called a unit. So in Australia, you can sit on a lounge in the lounge room and then go and get under your Manchester and your doona. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if there are any differences that I've missed. Please.
Yeah, that was interesting. Tell me if there was anything else that's different. Like, I guess for being from the UK, I just take a lot of them for granted. I didn't realise that there would be so much difference. It's almost like nothing is the same in an Australian house. Not just the actual architecture of the building, like everything within it, even the terminology is different as well. So yeah, tell me what you think about that. Tell me if all of that is applicable to you in Australia. Is there anything different in your Australian home? Anything that's more similar to the British one? Thanks.